Is that better? Thank you. Thanks. Danny, thanks really very much. And perhaps the privilege that I've had in my life, and especially my academic life, is a few introductions under my belt, but none has been more personal or more heartfelt than that. Nor has a visit to a place been more, I think, heartfelt, and especially with the presence of the United States military. A little background on me that Danny doesn't know, but I was born the first year of the boomers, 1946. I know that makes me old stuff. I get it. But if you can imagine, I was born to parents and families in neighborhoods and communities that had just won the Second World War. I had an uncle who was my favorite uncle, married to my favorite aunt, who as an enlisted person was a paratrooper and jumped behind the lines in Europe, who the GI Bill put through the University of Dayton, where he got his bachelor's and then his master's degree, re-entered in Korea as a major, and led a company of paratroopers actually and jumped in Korea, and went on to be one of America's most successful businessmen. To say that I've been influenced by the United States military and what it does, and then to win a scholarship to put me through medical school from the Navy is just, it's just amazing. And I still get goosebumps and say the 10 years of active duty that I had were some of the best 10 years in my life. I wish, today was going to be a lot of fun for you because you're clinical and you're learning. And the medical students and the residents and the fellows are still really the heart of why I went into academic medicine. I love to teach, and I especially like to teach in the recess bay in the operating room. But this is a little bit bigger than, let's say, reviewing the 1,000 mistakes I've made on the journey of doing damage control surgery for various types of injuries, or other topics that might be more pertinent to you as medical students, to residents, and to even some of the junior faculty. For the last almost 18 months, this has been the principal talk that I've been asked to deliver, primarily because this is a wave of the future. As you sit here, parts of this recommendation from the National Academy of Science is rolling out in the Department of Defense at the American College of Surgeons and beginning to roll out at certain medical centers around the United States. And what is going to, we hope, transform in the next 10 years or 20 years, I can't predict it, is a change in the way the system for America responds to injury, to lower deaths, especially preventable deaths, and to prevent disability. Let's see, Phil, do I just hit forward for this? Is it screen sensitive? Yeah, I will, thanks. Uh-oh. Okay. That's not responding. Sorry about that. I can do this too. Thanks. So let me just say it was really nice to hear such kind comments about the University of Pennsylvania, and it was great just a few minutes ago to meet a young medical student on his way to do his master's in public health and clinical epidemiology and biostatistics down the road from this building. Everybody remembers that Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. You don't remember that it actually has a second nickname, which is the city of first. We were the first of many things in America, but this, for our and your information, the first medical school, the first hospital, the Pennsylvania Hospital, which still has buildings standing, that Ben Franklin roamed the halls, and the first university teaching hospital. I don't get it, Phil. What am I don't want to end show. Pardon me? Want me to do that one? All right, thanks, okay. All right. The other thing that's been really exciting about the University of Pennsylvania is that within the last 5 years, Danny said, why did you leave in 2011? It was actually 12, Dan, I know you couldn't wait to get rid of me. But in all honesty, I stepped down because I was the chief for 25 years, and I think when you're the chief, the chairman, or the leader for 25 years, it's long overdue to leave and let some young blood take over. but also to do this project. And I was the physician-in-chief of building this freestanding trauma and critical care building dedicated to the trauma patient. And what was fascinating, and some of you know this history, is that John Pryor was our fellow, our friend, our colleague, our trainee, and finished and stayed on the faculty with us and very quickly became our trauma director of a very busy urban-based trauma center. John was killed on Christmas Day of 2008 in Mosul. He was one of 3 surgeons that were killed during Iraq and Afghanistan. I took that phone call, and it changed my life. And in 2010, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I said, we're going to build a hospital, and the whole entire first floor is going to be dedicated to John Pryor. And guess what? They turned to me and said, yes, it is. And so to stay and do that was just really remarkable, as is that unit. And it's great to have it named after John. There's nothing I really need to claim except to tell you that the opinions that I'm going to talk about today are mine. They've been derived from working for about 18 months at the National Academy of Science as one of the committee members to look at one nation, one system. And they don't express the views of the Department of Defense, the College of Surgeons, or the university. I also have to tell you, and I'm sorry you can't hear that, see that very well, that's 2011, the graduation party for our fellows. And just to let you know, there are 3, naval officers there, all medical corps, all commanders, lieutenant commanders. There's Travis Polk, Peter Hammer, and with an embrace from one of his buddies, Dan Grabeau. And what's interesting is all 3 of those men sequentially left the University of Pennsylvania and went to Los Angeles, where they directed the Navy Trauma Training Center for 2-year stints each. Tremendous, tremendous opportunity that we've had with the Department of Defense, with 23 of our physicians actually being sent from the Army, Navy, Air Force to train with us, all of which have deployed multiple times. This is what I'm going to do, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on the history of trauma centers, except to give you some relevance. I will tell you that 51 years ago, 45 years ago, trauma systems didn't exist. As a matter of fact, trauma systems nationally don't exist right now, and that's why this report is so positive, or so important to the future of the care of the injured. And for the medical students, or people that don't necessarily know what changes us, and by changes us, I mean societies, cultures, nations. What changes us actually is war. The greatest stimulant to change medicine and surgery and how we practice, especially in the care of the injured, is war. Those names should be very familiar to you, whether you're a first-year medical student or a senior emeritus professor. Hippocrates, Paré, and especially Larrey wrote, even Bill Roth wrote a treatise about the management of gunshot wounds that trained how physicians in the 14th, 15th, 17th, 18th, 20th, and 21st century have changed. And what's interesting about that is that going back to my comment that 51 years ago trauma centers didn't exist, this is a timeline of national initiatives to build trauma centers, trauma surgeons, trauma teams, and trauma systems. And it's an incomplete history, but it starts approximately 51 years ago when the first white paper, Accidental Death and Disability, from the National Research Council was developed by a group of individuals who were military and civilian, who had experienced Korea, where a single pamphlet captured and memorialized for the United States Army the lessons learned in Korea, and then they were forgotten until Vietnam started again. And had it not been for a lieutenant colonel medical corps in the Army who wrote the monograph in Korea, and then was a 3-star general in the medical corps in the Army during Vietnam, those lessons wouldn't have been translated. But the brilliant thing was the National Research Council took note of what was going on in Vietnam, formed an interdisciplinary group, and this is the report that led to 911, critical care specialist, special facilities to do emergency medicine, and many other things. This really spawned 50 years of development and 50 years of trying to lead to a national trauma system. Now notice that the report itself and the first block is outlined in black. It signifies something because between 1973 and 1976, the military and civilian surgical and medical alignment that had taken place in this country for the first 175 years split apart. We lost the draft. We lost the Berry Plan. And the political outfall of the Vietnam War separated the military from civilians. I wore the uniform in those days, and there was a directive that we were not allowed to be in public in our uniform because of the malign thoughts, deeds, and words put out against the United States military. The downfall for that was the separation, the stop of the bidirectional flow of talent, knowledge, and clinical experience between the medical corps of the United States military and the academic departments of surgery and eventually orthopedic surgery, etc., in the country. And to many of us, it was devastating. But those people, that initiative from the College of Surgeons, orthopedics, eventually emergency medicine, nursing, the development of the paramedic programs led to this chart. And don't worry, the dots are not exactly right. It's an incomplete chart. I just actually gave this talk in Montana, and they said, why don't we have a dot? And I said, you can have a dot. I'll put it on for you. But the point of it is that this is incomplete. This is looking at one large data set. It doesn't look at all trauma centers. But what developed in the last 50 years is perhaps the greatest engine, academic, research, clinical engine in the world for the advancement of the care of the injured. And this is just sampling actually this is modestly busy trauma centers. Interestingly, a previous report from the Institute of Medicine in 2007 said that perhaps the greatest contribution to public health in the latter 20th century was the United States trauma system. They got it wrong. It's actually trauma centers. And that article, that's that landmark article from Ellen McKenzie in the New England Journal of Medicine, that basically said for those states that had some type of a system that could get a seriously injured patient to a trauma center, they had a 25% increase in survival from the most severe injuries. But that system that's described there in that cartoon was incomplete because it had no federal mandate or leadership. Let me give you a few contradictions. We say system all the time. West Virginia doesn't have a system. Pennsylvania's been at it for 30 years building a system. We don't have a complete system. What we have is a patchwork of islands that work very effectively, but we have no ability to say that all Americans, regardless of where they are injured, have the same chance of survival. And we're not just talking about the fact that some are rural, like in parts of your state and parts of our state, versus metropolitan. In fact, there are large areas that have EMS, hospitals, trauma centers, discoordinated function. The most severe patients don't get to those trauma centers. It's really a patchwork quilt of gaps. And in some areas, the performance in our best trauma centers to our not so good trauma centers is profoundly different. So where you are injured in this country, still to this day, determines if you survive or not. Here's another thing. We don't have comprehensive data. We have from those islands of excellence, specifically the very, very, very well-funded trauma centers and the American College of Surgeons and a few other databases, we know what goes on in our best hospitals, but we don't know what goes on in pre-hospital care. We don't have long-term output, so I can't tell you what my patients with head injuries or spinal cord injuries or even severe thoracic or musculoskeletal injury are like at 2 years. So we can't use that to feedback in what we do and what we deliver. If you don't believe that, here's Pennsylvania, 30 years of legislation, enhanced payment for verified trauma centers for both professional fees and hospital-based fees. And we've been at this for 30 some odd years. This is hot off the press, presented at the AAST by Fred Rogers and his group from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And what it did is it took the trauma foundations statewide registry. This is the Pennsylvania Trauma System Foundation, perhaps the best trauma data in the world. And it compared it to PHC4. You don't need to know what that is, but that's statewide data looking at all hospital discharges by ICD-9 codes and DRGs. And it compared where did trauma patients go. And what Fred did is broke it down by injury severity score. And what you need to know about that is injury severity score greater than 15 is considered major, and the higher it goes, critical injury. And what this 2015 data set shows is that with 40 trauma centers covering about 80% of our population in Pennsylvania, 33% of those with major or critical injury go to non-trauma centers. In a state that has worked for 30 years and through insurance and reimbursement funded this trauma system, it just begs doing a preventable death study. Here's another thing. The United States is woefully behind in funding academic, basic translational, and epidemiologic research in injury compared to the burden of the disease called injury, death, and disability. And if you don't believe that, that's a very recent comparison of all funding by disease, that's the long axis up, compared to the burden and the amount of dollars. And you can see where injury is. Now, you might not think that there's relevance to you, but if you're a young assistant professor starting in whatever field, or you want to build a sim center, or you want to build an epidemiologic project, if you are working in cancer, cardiac, if you are working in anthrax or infectious disease, you have a better chance of getting funded from the NIH than you do for America's leading cause of death of its young. It's got to be fixed. And here's the other thing. We might think our systems and our learning and even in our trauma centers are dynamic. Medicine is anything but dynamic. As a matter of fact, scientific discovery to practice, whether it's in science, engineering, or law, is very long and prolonged. This is a recent 2017 grant that looks at from the time research proves that it works to becoming a standard in mental health, and you know there is some tremendous focus on this right now with some of the opioid problems and other things going on in the United States. But that grant was deliberately aimed at funding researchers that could decrease the 17 years it takes to get from research to practice. Let's turn now for a little bit of history, the longest period of war in the history of the United States, and use that as a backdrop for study analysis and the development of the global system, and perhaps to be astounded in these next few slides. I don't need to tell this department and this university about the accomplishments of the United States military and specifically its medical service corps. This is the global trauma system, and I will just tell you the likes of which have never been seen in the history of man. But what's interesting and unique about this is what they did is they got system-wide data from the point of injury to long-term recovery through the VA. And what they did through a very, very knowledgeable and motivated workforce is they looked and identified gaps, they informed the researchers, they provided information to the clinicians, and they changed policy at the level of the Secretary of Defense in order to save more lives. And they did it in a matter of months. Months when they needed to. This is an interesting one, and perhaps in the report that I'm going to show you in a few minutes is the most informative. Preventable death. The most common type of death that is preventable after injury, whether it's civilian or on a battlefield, is bleeding to death. Whether it's in Morgantown or Kandahar, it is bleeding to death. And everything that goes on in combat surgery or trauma surgery and emergency care is aimed at taking care of bleeding. Yes, head injury remains the most common cause of death, but not preventable death. And through these studies, using the type of data I just described to you, Essentially what they identified is 30% of the deaths on the battlefield could have been preventable if care would have been rendered quicker, care would have been altered to do certain things. And they carried this off in a matter of months and did amazing things, as I just described to you. And this is really what it showed. It wasn't about the surgeon in the hospital or the surgical team or the recess team. It was moving care far forward and starting to look at what could go on at the point of contact, the point of explosion, the point of injury. It said not only that, but once we do that, if we can momentarily control bleeding, how can we move them en route care and provide very advanced life support? And how can we train people to use things that they've never seen before and roll that out across thousands of miles to thousands of providers in environments that you and I could never imagine? And what resulted in that is just what you see on that graph. As injury severity score went up, the top line, case fatality went down with increasing power of destructive weaponry. And let me tell you, it was amazing and astounding. But the military, across all three corps, the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy, has a problems. When they go to war, as you can see there by the red line, they have a tremendous experience. But then the war winds down and goes away, and in between, they have no way of sustaining their workforce as the experts they are. The lessons are lost. Think about the lieutenant colonel in Korea writes a monograph at lays fallow until about 1963, and somebody picks it up and says, we got to do this. And it's not intentional, it's just that the military medical corps have to go back to doing something that they do and do very well, which is take care of all the beneficiaries and the people that run the Department of Defense. So the combat medical workforce cannot train and maintain its expertise, and then arising at the same time is this a threat to national security? Because you can't deploy troops unless they are supported, and those troops know that, by outstanding medical providers that are there with them on the battlefield. Well, let me just say that in 2011, 12, and 13, a number of leading authorities took notice, not just of the astounding ability to save people, but of the system and the speed with which the system could conduct and analyze data and improve its performance, as I said again, in environments the likes of which you and I have never seen. And they went to a place that you may not know of. And so for the faculty, I apologize. This is probably pretty common knowledge to everybody. But to the medical students and residents, this is the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, known as the National Academies. It used to contain the Institute of Medicine, Engineering, and Science, and then they merged it just a few years ago, and it's now known as the National Academies. Well, it was founded in 1863, and it really is founded and signed into law by Abraham Lincoln to investigate, examine, experiment, and report on any subject of science. And it's where authorities, people go and say, in a nonpartisan, apolitical way, this is a problem we think for health and medicine, initially in the United States, but now it's a global think tank too. And it conducts a tedious process of fairness, review, analysis, and publication. So this was the committee that was formed. It was a very transdisciplinary committee. There's a few common names there, including a Peter Muka previous lecturer, which is John Holcomb. There's Phil Spinelli there, way over on the side, which you can see. And John Holcomb and Phil Spinelli, for the surgeons, are really the people that really developed the concept of one-to-one resuscitation and damage control resuscitation. Ellen McKenzie is there, the editor-in-chief of actually the Annals of Internal Medicine. There is an ethics and a person there. There's a regulator there. It was fabulous under the leadership of Don Berwick, who at one time was the head of CMS and now is the head of a large think tank for medicine and global health in Cambridge. And this was the charge of the committee: characterize and memorialize this partnership between a joint trauma system and a very, very responsive defense health research program. Ensure that the advances in trauma care are sustained and built upon for the future, so when the first day of the next war goes, the first wounded soldier has the best chance to survive like they did on the last day of the previous war. Recommend strategies for bidirectional integration and describe a sustainable and durable system of learning to optimize trauma care in military and civilian systems. And so we're sitting around in a committee, and this sounds all doable. You know, this sounds easy. Well, there's a few challenges. Let me just share a few with you. I always try to provide everybody that I teach with kind of, this is the necessary, so this is the classic comic book or the little black and gold book that you wanted to know, the Cliff Notes. And that is, if you get a chance, this is all free online. You can download the PDF. But honestly, the abstract and the summary are really worthwhile. And any of you that are interested in trauma systems, this chapter 2 should be the first thing you read. This was written by Ellen McKenzie, who perhaps in this country, if not the world, is the leading authority from a science point of view on trauma systems. So the first thing we had to do is, how do you take this blockage, this lack of ability to work together, this lack of ability to learn together, away from the military and the civilians and join them at the hip? And interestingly, previous people, including Don Trunke, had written about this and how this was such an impediment, especially when it comes to injury and combat surgery and battlefield medicine, to advancing medicine. So we had to look at that. And what we really came up with in a very short time is just this. There has to be one system for one nation. There has to be a national trauma care system in which the Department of Defense and Department of Health and Human Services and other adjacent and supportive cabinet level departments merge the system, the national trauma system, as you can see there. A uniform effort is needed to ensure the delivery of optimal trauma care to save lives in America, whether they're in the United States or on a battlefield. And this quote from Don Berwick perhaps was our charge, if you would. Military and civilian trauma care will be optimized together or not at all. And we really felt that, and that is reported to the United States government, as you saw the charges of the National Academy of Science. And this is the Big Four. This is the take-home message. Create and develop the Big Four. A National Trauma Action Plan. White House, do an executive order that actually has some meaning and order that your departments make this happen. An action plan. Create a national trauma system with a locus, an authority, a coordinating body in the federal government that looks at this particular disease and develops the system and provides standards, and I'll come back to that. Correct the deficit in research funding so that we can improve survival. And last, and to me the most important, create the bidirectional flow of learning by partnering the military and civilian workforce so that they can be and maintain expertise. Every one of these reports has to have an aim. You have to come up with something very short, and this came from Dave Marcosi. Some of you may know that name, and especially the military guys in the Army, but Dave is I think now a lieutenant colonel reserves, if not a full bird, but he is an associate professor of emergency medicine at University of Maryland, was on the White House staff through the Obama administration, a phenomenally brilliant guy, and basically one day he said, 0 preventable deaths. The aim is, in the United States of America, the richest country in the world, that no one should die after injury, and we should attempt to minimize trauma-related disability, and that became really the aim of the first recommendation. In order to go on, I have to tell you that we expanded the previous definitions from the Health and Human Services. These were 1980 and 1990 definitions of the workforce or the system, and that is, we went ahead and did exactly what the military had shown us. We did point of injury to recovery and re-entry into their families and workforce, so that we could then go ahead and say we need data from the time someone injures to the time that they are re-entering the workforce and fully recovered. And we expanded it not just to clinical providers and teams, but to all the support, and founded that whole workforce on research. I'm not going to take you through 11 recommendations and 61 subordinate recommendations. Let me tell you, you can download the PDF, read it every night before you go to bed. You'll be asleep in 10 minutes. It'll be a good thing. But I do want to mention just 3 things that I've highlighted in yellow: leadership and culture of learning, the National Trauma and Injury Research Agenda, and systems for enduring the workforce. So let me just tell you how this works. What has to happen, as I said before, the the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, are directed by what you'll see are these recommendations, and now Defense actually has a law and it's appropriated, will go ahead and carry out these recommendations. Shared aims, infrastructure, system design, data, best practices, and personnel. And the way it works looks like this. The federal government has to take the lead. As I've said, the Department of Defense is already moving on this. Health and Human Services, as you probably know, has had a few slowdowns. But the point of it is what the federal government has to do, as they've done in many other areas in health, is create, if you would, the vision, the aim, the oversight, and provide some startup funding and tell the departments to go ahead and work on policy frameworks, standards, and incentives so the states and the larger municipalities on the civilian side and the combatant commands along with the JTS carry out actually the infrastructure to be put in place to support, deliver the care, provide the quality improvement, and do the research. Very dynamic, but bringing into mind that all care is delivered locally. All care is provided actually by people, and that we have to go ahead and understand that and win them as our stakeholders and champions. The first thing just to tell you is, and if you read across under the word, under the title and look at agenda, this is the only recommendation that comes up, or the only area that comes up actually in 5 different recommendations, and these are direct. Fix the research problem. Move it up. Move it up for the sake of the people that are injured, but also to go ahead and to create, if you would, a battalion of scientists that can go ahead and look and identify the gaps and to start to do the research that we need. Understand that young investigators are interested in this and will build their academic career and advance knowledge through it. The next one is the system, and I don't want to bore you down about this, but think about a very dynamic system where you're providing care, you're capturing what's going on digitally, including the patient experience. You're providing that back into a group of people that can analyze that data, identify what's working and not, go ahead and put that into a performance improvement model with experts to develop evidence-based guidelines that are constantly being looked at and renewed and assured that are concurrent and at the best, if you would, the frontier of practice. It is disseminated timely through devices that you either carry on your wrist, wear in your teeth, and now I just heard you could go ahead and have one put in your teeth and you could say hello, and the next thing you know you're getting this, or you're wearing something or in front of a screen that can deliver you. Tacit delivery of knowledge as you need it. I've never put in a chest tube. The man needs a chest tube. Bang, in front of you with somebody guiding you how to do that. And then constant transparency and improvement and incentives to improve the quality of care. I took a minute to explain that to you because this is perhaps the most important, if you would, of the sketches of the report, which is this is a dynamic learning trauma care system adapted from the model of the joint trauma system of the Department of Defense and its Defense Health Board. I just want to mention, what's the biggest bang for the buck you want to get going? Because it's gotten going. And that is, you need to know that pre-hospital care, the wonderful altruistic champions out there putting their lives in jeopardy every night and every day, providing wonderful care, are now a part of the health system. Pre-hospital care gets paid to transport. They don't get paid to deliver care. They don't have to report data. Had their leaders not be as altruistic as so many wonderful people in the field of emergency care, we wouldn't know anything about pre-hospital care. There's no mandate to go ahead and share it with us. And so what really has to happen is that rather than being a part of the Department of Transportation, pre-hospital care has to be linked to healthcare delivery so we can start to analyze and improve and find the gaps. And so recommendation is very strong, and this is one that's already taking place at the College of Surgeons and the Committee on Trauma, which is to take the National EMS database, not a strong database, but it has things in it that we can use, and link it with the American College of Surgeons National Trauma Database, the NTDB, and start to go ahead and to line those up so that we can identify gaps and find out where we need to improve. Again, like Pennsylvania, I think this is going to immediately lead to preventable death studies, what goes on in pre-hospital. But let me show you a little bit which I think is the most important, and if you remember that 51-year timeline and my telling you that it came from the military-civilian effort back in the early 1960s, and it's driven us for 50 years thanks to the College of Surgeons and the American Nursing Association and emergency medicine. It's the workforce that are not only the key to survival and are motivated to do this, but really will advance trauma systems and trauma care. So let's go back. I'm going to say that every surgeon and many of the residents here, every physician knows this paraphrase quote. Hippocrates, Ambrose Pare, Bill Roth, I don't know who really said it, but somebody said, he who wishes to be a surgeon should go to war. Wait a minute. You're sending surgeons that don't know how to do war surgery to war? I was very lucky, actually, in 2014 to deliver the Scudder oration and then write the Scudder paper that's required of that oration for the College of Surgeons. I spent a year doing research. Dan Grabeau and 4 of 5 of my other fellows were actually, whether they were on site or deployed or in other parts of the world, were my advisors about the military for this. And let me tell you that what I learned by listening to what they were doing, young surgeons deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, what they were doing, we had to change the paradigm. And the paradigm had to be this. He who desires to go to war must first learn war surgery. We needed to deploy experts, not people that were OJTing. And we needed to train figure out how to do that. This is, I won't go into this, but this is actually from a different presidential address in which I analyzed what the individual surgeons were doing while they were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And let me just read a few things if you can't see this. This is actually Lieutenant Colonel Sloan Guy, now actually a cardiac surgeon in Cornell, but this is one of his deployments to Afghanistan in 2005. 11 craniotomies, 82 amputations, 7 neck explorations, 7 thoracotomies or sternotomies, 7 vascular repairs, 4 liver resections, 2 pulmonary lobectomies. He delivered 1 baby, etc., etc. I'm going to defy if any of you in your general surgical practice can do all that. We're either in a time warp and I'm back in the 1930s. Nobody does this. But yet, here are 3 individuals, all of which doing those things. Immediately as they deploy and get in country. How do we train them? We can't because of our specialty lines. Keep that in mind for a minute. Here was the other thing. We started to look at some wonderful work done by military and questionnaires of people pre- and post-deployment. This is actually a 2012 questionnaire paper in the Journal of Trauma by Tyler and et al. And it really looks at what did general surgeons do when they deployed. 70% took care of brain injury. 13% did a neurosurgical procedure. Wait a minute. Lieutenant Colonel Guy just did 11 craniotomies in the middle of Afghanistan at a forward unit. And they treated children and did humanitarian care and essential care, and they delivered babies. But the most challenging were vascular and thoracic and burns and neuro. And they had no familiarity of it. And why? Because they never encountered it either in their non-deployed setting or in their training programs. Or the time lapse between doing one of these procedures and having to do it in the battlefield was too long. And when you ask them what they would request more training so they were better prepared, it appeared in table number 5. And it was all about vascular and exposure. As a matter of fact, what this did to me is it defined something that I needed to change the fellowship at Penn, because the biggest skill that all of my fellows needed to learn is control bleeding in every body cavity. You will save more people's lives. I don't care about the definitive repair, but emphasize control of bleeding. In the Scudder, I also quoted this paper. This is a British paper again, later from Afghanistan, and it looks at the most important thing that took away, that we know and we have to adapt from the military. It's about the team. It's not about you as the surgeon individually, or the anesthesiologist, or the critical care. It's about the team. This looks at what was necessary to do in a very hot time at a British hospital in Afghanistan. And essentially it said the same thing that the American deployed surgeons were saying. Expanded skill set and proficiency, vascular, thoracic, pelvic, ortho, neuro, burn, team training, and innovative pre-deployment experiences. Let's see about this and how well surgeons deployed with the United States military to Iraq and Afghanistan felt their teams were prepared. This is 86 responders to a survey that we conducted previous to the Scudder, and what it shows is basically half the surgeons upon deployment felt that the operating room teams and the recess teams were not prepared for what they had to encounter. So, as we're thinking about this, we're thinking, wait a minute, we have civilian surgeons and teams, and we have military surgeons and teams, and both are really saying the same thing. They're not being prepared to do combat surgery or civilian trauma surgery. We have preventable death studies from the hospitals that say that if there's a bleeding chest injury, they have to wait for a thoracic or chest surgeon to come in. If there's a bleeding blood vessel in the leg, they have to go ahead and put pressure on it, wait for a vascular surgeon to come in. This is crazy. And so the committee, back to the committee, said, wait a minute, we think we need a new surgeon skill set that matches the needs of the patient. Wow, that's revolutionary. We have little or no team training for resuscitation in the operating room. When's the last time we did that? Brand new anesthesiologist, brand new operating room nurse. When's the last time you trained with them in the best academic medical center actually in the state of West Virginia? Lucky if it happens. And on. So let me just say that the first recommendation we made was this, that really to do combat surgery and in the future, hopefully civilian trauma surgery, it requires a different set of tools that are stabilization and hemorrhage control. It's got to come across specialty lines. It's got to ignore the fact that there's a political demarcation between body cavities and certain vessels. It's got to include some essential and emergency skills. And then we turned and asked the military surgeons where they might like to acquire that. And this is what they said. This is actually one of the questions that we sent out in a questionnaire, 86 responders, and here's what it said. It said, in our opinion, as military surgeons, and this particular questionnaire, by the way, almost the majority of these people had been deployed at least once. Over half had been deployed twice. They said, assign us to a full-time trauma center in an academic medical center where they're doing now, we can do this stuff all the time. Or assign us to a military treatment facility, a military hospital, but we periodically rotate in to that civilian academic trauma center to maintain our skills and to teach teams. And then we should probably consider converting some of the military bigger hospitals to level 1 civilian trauma centers so they serve the community in which they lie. So we said, wow, this is a win-win. Do we have capacity? This was another thing we did. The dots are still not in the right place, but let me tell you, we used NTDB data, and I'm just going to cut to the chase. There is huge capacity to be able to take on full military combat teams, multidisciplinary, and train them in our busiest trauma centers across the United States. So essentially, the second recommendation was people that do this work require constant practice in high-volume trauma centers where they can maintain their expertise, both civilian and especially military, so that for rapidly deployable teams, the day they arrive in country or wherever they have to go, those skills are highly expert and the team is very proficient. I'm not going to have you bored with this thing, but I will tell you there's one thing you should note. Specifically the recommendation, and this is the only one that was time sensitive, that said about creating this expert workforce for the military was within 1 year. So let me abbreviate. Number 11 recommendation, and the subordinate recommendation says this: build integrated platforms to assure a ready and expert trauma care workforce. Doesn't have to say military and civilian because we're going to do it together. They're going to be fully partnered. And it directs the DoD and the Defense Health Agency to create platforms of continuous bi-directional learning, career development, training, and research. By the way, if you read a 1916 National Research Council directive, it's almost this identical wording, and it was done in order for Woodrow Wilson to reach out to the academic departments of surgery in the United States and say, organize hospitals to go to the First World War. And some are very, very famous, and that also happened in the Second World. This is what is going to happen, I think. Some of this is my opinion. There's going to be regionally and competitively selective, very good trauma centers that have the right fit and have the commitment, like this one, okay, to train military trauma teams. Some of those will be located in our safety net hospitals, those large urban hospitals that desperately need staffing and experts to do it. And what you're going to see is fully integrated staff and a dynamic need-based surgeon and trauma team training platform. And that'll be used to sustain military teams. And it will continue, it will benefit us tremendously on the civilian sector. As we thought more about this, I really think, and this is my opinion, I think for those of you who are in the leadership of American surgery now, you really have to bite the bullet. We have to go back and retool the trauma critical care training programs, especially the fellowships. Probably the military will create a combat surgery fellowship for orthopedics and general surgery. But I think what we really have to do is we have to work with our colleagues and we have to define a skill set that cross specialty lines and gives our trauma surgeons the things that they are needing, not only for the individual patient, but as civilian hospitals and civilian trauma centers are responding to more and more multiple casualty incident and active shooting incidents. It's now become every day in the United States. I'm going to end here and just say, rather than try to get into this, if you want to just do one thing, if I could assign you one reading task, it's very easy, is go online to JAMA in September in 2016. This is Don Berwick, our chairman of the committee, who wrote this very short but elegant 3-page summary of this report. Why it is so important, the highlights of what our findings were, but most importantly, the key recommendation, the big 4. And it takes you 5 minutes and you'll have it, and that I think will lead you to the report. Let me just end with this, and this is important, and all of the lectures that I give about this topic end with this. This committee, and this is really a very emotional thing for all of us on this committee, we heard so much testimony from enlisted, from officers, from leaders, from generals, from admirals, from observers, from researchers. We were so impressed. The care that was rendered was astounding. But men and women, Americans, lost their lives. And at the beginning of the writing of this report, which took us 6 months, this was the first thing that we wrote as a group. And I would like to leave you with that last paragraph, and that is, our job is to carry this forth in the honor of the sacrifices of an entire generation by ensuring that the lessons learned over the longest period of armed conflict in the history of the United States are not lost. We didn't lose John Pryor for nothing. Thank you very much. Sorry. Thanks. Thanks. I'll be glad to answer questions if there's.
So, take a moment here. When he gets choked up, that gets me choked up, and then that'll get the rest of you choked up, and that'll be a problem. But really appreciate the talk, and I think it was a great overview of really what's happening and how trauma care and trauma systems across the U.S. are going to be changing. And we talk about this at multiple levels. The College of Surgeons, we talked about it when we were at our regional meetings. Many of you are looking to go into trauma and emergency care, and I think you're going to see many of these changes occurring. But we really want to thank you for taking the time to come and really appreciate your expertise. Any particular questions for Dr. Schwab?
Deborah?
Thank you very much. Regarding the initiative for trauma research funding, considering this is really related, do you think that the limitations that are currently on the book about funding unclassified research are going to impede that?
It's a great question. So let me give you just a little background. What he's really asking us is that if you go back about 20 years now and you look at firearm violence related research, which is, as soon as you add the word firearm to anything or the word gun, especially in federal funding, it's a very, very hot political problem. And so both the CDC and the NIH were gagged. They have been not totally removed, but the language with subsequent refinement of those directives has been softened so that there is money available to it. I thought what you were going to ask me is that because the military actually now has gone ahead and appropriated funds to look at trauma and combat casualty research through the Fort Detrick Command, do you think the NIH feels like that's enough? And the answer to that one is categorically no. We looked at the two funding streams, the amounts, we looked at the burden, and we also looked at the unidentified gaps. And we really feel like that the NIH just, and we can't explain it, and this is beyond the committee, but the leaders of the societies that asked us to look at this, as well as the Institute of Medicine, really feels like the NIH for some reason is not funding injury research. So we hope that. We hope, if you give me two things I really wish for right now would be correct the research problem, at least start to correct it, and the other thing is to implement the combined partnerships for enhanced training. Yes, ma'am. So the answer is yes, and it's a little bit historic. So the question was, if you go ahead and you look at why there's been so limited resources, but yet you showed that there have been considerable advances, was there any one place or two places that I felt was really, let's say, an excellent? Historically, there were systems that emerged and really led the way in certain areas. For example, San Diego County. The county of San Diego, because of some inspired leadership, some household names in our world, Steve Shackford, David Hoyt, and Brent Eastman, all very, very prominent surgeons, very, very prominent in performance improvement, along with actually Peg Friedland, a nurse, and actually the EMS director, who was an administrator. That five wrote so many papers about performance improvement of trauma centers and trauma systems in the late 1980s and 1990s. They were visionaries. They were ahead of their times. I'm not tooting our state's horn, but if you look at EMS and EMS coordination with trauma centers, Pittsburgh is a very, very, very good place to look. If you want to really dig down into this and get into the history, all you really need to do is jump on to the free PDF, go to the second chapter, and look at the references that Ellen used to write her chapter, and it shows you a lot of these really fantastic pilot studies. You know, that leads to a comment here. How is the federal government create incentives? Some of you may be much more knowledgeable about this than I am, but the way they'll create incentives is they'll go ahead through the departments, mostly Health and Human Services, but also Justice, Homeland Security, and they'll give pilot or seed money. And they'll look around the country and say, hey, these people got it figured out. The state of Connecticut, does the state of Connecticut have all of its hospitals organized in order to respond to a mass disaster? And the answer would be, I don't know if organized, but on paper they have a pretty good plan. So they may actually say, here's incentive money to the states to go ahead and make that available and then to inform the rest of the country. But it was a great question. Thanks. And we're probably over time.
One other thing that we have an opportunity to highlight, the partnership between the military and civilian service program is called they're calling the SPEAR teams. And many of you wonder some of the other things that we have that are going on behind the scenes and things, but we actually we were in the top 8 for consideration for one of those teams. So though we weren't ultimately chosen, just so you know, we are engaged and we are looking to be involved in things. So as you see folks coming in and out, various training opportunities, you're going to have the opportunity to interface with more and more folks, I think, as time goes on. And so with that, I think we will stop.
I make one other comment. I forgot to do this at the beginning because I was still giggling, but there's a fella in the audience that I need to recognize. So when we say teams and we say surgeons, I just want to remind you, the surgeons or those that want to be surgeons, we're really good at what we do. We can't do a thing without an anesthesiologist. We can't do a thing. The best person that you could probably take on any team with you is your anesthesiologist, and I have to recognize a new faculty member, Mike Russell, who's sitting back there, who did his fellowship with us in anesthesia critical care, but was brave enough to do a trauma elective with us and got to do his first chest tube with us. But then stayed for 8 years at Penn and was the trauma anesthesiologist. And I say this a lot, and it's interesting how much I miss him because he advanced the anesthesia side of injury care so much. And Michael, let me just tell you, if I had it deployed, I'd take you with me. Thanks.